3 days left until the end of the Null and Void Battle Pass, so some of this information is going to seem a little bit late to you, but I guess you could use it to your advantage. So firstly, when initially released, the Werewolf Commander and the OK Walker stickers didn't play any sounds. I think I featured these stickers without any sounds, but they do now have sounds. Actually, no, I do remember actually playing these sounds. But I don't know, the Werewolf Commander, it looks like it's holding a snowball, it's actually the moon, but that's fair enough. So the next thing I want to feature is a enemy that actually buffs your towers. So through the thing in question is the Corrupted Pyromancer. If I were to spawn that in, and time to scale it to 0.5 to clearly see this, so the Corrupted Pyromancer, it has now attacked this Golden Scout, and it now has a 30% fire rate increase, except in reality it's around 42.85%. But more interestingly, when it comes to the Scout, the range has apparently increased. Now originally, when it came to the Null Pyromancer, it would actually increase the range of these towers. So the 16.1 range that it has here, imagine that the Pyromancer, it applied 14 range to, well, it had, if the Scout here had 14 range and the Null Pyromancer were to apply its 50% range decrease, it would actually increase the range of these towers by 15%. But the developers have fixed it, so this is no longer the case. So if I were to spawn in a Pyromancer here, and then you were to see this Scout, it has now decreased correctly by 15% to 14 range. So the developers have fixed it since. There were also some issues with some of the Null and Void enemies being positioned sideways in the index. I still do believe that some enemies are positioned sideways in the index, but the developers have now fixed it, and the Scared debuff does no longer, it doesn't increase the tower's range instead of decreasing it. Now, there's also, or there was, a thing where if you didn't actually choose a curse, for example, if you got, like, Death, or whichever the one that gives Mutation, and I don't know what's another bad one, but if you were to not choose a curse back in the day, back when you started the Null and Void event, you actually did not have a curse applied to you if, like, nobody voted. But the developers have now fixed it so that if you didn't choose a curse in time, so in the minute or so that you are required to choose a curse, then the game would randomly choose a curse for you, meaning that you are now being forced to choose something. Now, the developers have actually also released an update when it comes to some tower sounds, and in fact some game sounds, not being muted by the settings. But the thing is, these fixes are quite numerous, and it looks like the developers have just fixed these issues without telling anyone, which I would have thought the developers would have said at least that sounds have been fixed in the settings so that they can now be muted. But instead, I'm just going to read out of all of the sounds that the developers have fixed, which means that they can be muted in the settings, although do bear in mind that some sounds have not been fixed. So on the top of my head, a sound that's not been fixed is the piggy bank from the Crook boss. That sound still plays whenever the Crook boss, the Game Master Crook boss skin generates a piggy bank, and you cannot mute it still. So, of all of the sounds, there's the Level 4 Ranger Explosion sound, the Cannoneer Elf Firing sound, the Gunner Elf Firing sound, the Ripped Elf Explosion sound, the Gunner APC Destruction Explosion and Firing sounds, the Missile APC Destruction Explosion and Firing sounds, Railgun Tanks Cannon sound, Snowball Elf's Snowball Hit sound, Military Base Flying sound, not the explosion sounds, these were affected before, the Necromancer Gravestone Destruction sound, the Freezer Frost Grenade Explosion sound, the Hallowpunk Explosion sounds, the Mercenary Base Plane sound, the Trapper Spike Traps Being Stepped on sound, the Frost Blaster Firing sound, and the Frost Legion Explosion sound. So a lot of changes. Although, as stated previously, not all of them were fixed. So, for example, the Multi-Monster Stepping sound still broken. The Commander Missile APCs, well, not APCs, sorry, the Commander Missiles are partially affected. And the Snowballer got even worse because not only does it play no sounds, it has no explosion, which is weird. Oh, and apparently the Mako DJ booth Switch voice lines are also not muted by the settings. Apparently, with the audio update to Tower Defense Simulator, there was some cases where some emotes weren't playing any sounds. So, for example, apparently the Flippin' Burger emote didn't play any sounds, but as you can hear, it is still now playing sounds. However, a bug fix that the developers have now reversed is the coffin emote. Previously, the cross would actually appear properly on the coffin emote, but as is the case, it's no longer the case. But you can see the cross is all the way over there now, rather than being like inside of the coffin like it originally was. So if I were to scale this down, oh wait, you cannot change your character scale while emoting. Okay, sorry, my bad game. So if I were to scale my character down and then use the coffin emote, where would the cross be? Nowhere? Where is it? Oh wait, Parrot Party's still here. I didn't realise Parrot Party was still here. I thought Poisoned was still here. Yeah, Poisoned's there, but Parrot Party is still part of the wheel. Interesting. Now, from release, Night 2 has been nerfed. So, for example, in easy mode, on wave 15, there used to be a Null Warden which spawned in. However, this has now been changed to a Null Medic because the Null Medic has less health, even though its abilities does mean that it can actually heal certain enemies, which could make it more of a threat. Its health in easy mode has also been nerfed from 3,500 to 1,750, but all Null Medics after wave 15 in easy mode now have bloated. So it now has basically, it has the same amount of health that it did previously. It's just, it's been nerfed for wave 15. In addition to this, the Null Guardian, which appears, it's been nerfed. So the Null Guardian, its easy health has been nerfed from 4.5k to 1.25k, and in hard mode its health has been nerfed from 25,000 health to 20,000 health, and its aggravation has been removed, although it doesn't have any animations when it appears in the index. As you can see here, we're talking about the Null Guardian clone and not the Null Guardian itself. The Null Guardian clone is just the Null Guardian, just slightly smaller. In addition to this, the boss itself has been nerfed from 2 speed to 1.8 speed. Now, when I was talking about the Null Pyromancer buffing towers, which has been fixed, it's not the case when it comes to the Null Guardian. Yes, the Null Guardian is actually able to buff towers. So, for example, here you can see the level 0 Scout, it has a fire rate of 0.6 if you max it out. However, when the Null Guardian does its Rage Mode ability, it then, now as you can see, seemingly buffs these towers by 15% fire rate. So actually, the Scout here now has a fire rate of 0.52. So yes, interestingly enough, the Null Guardian buffs the fire rate of towers if it uses its Rage Mode ability, which seems really odd if you think about it. Now, it's suspected that this is the case because when the developers were coding the Null Guardian's ability, when it came to the range debuff, when it came to its Rage Mode ability, Menton suspects that they've accidentally said that it's a minus 15% or minus 0.15 fire rate debuff. Which means that it's then, because it's a minus 0.15 fire rate debuff, it then turns it into a buff, because effectively a debuff is a negative thing, but minus a debuff is a positive thing. So it turns out that the Null Guardian buffs your towers, and it's very evident that it buffs your towers because of the icon, which the developers, even though there's been like countless gameplay of the Null Guardian, seemingly developers have not noticed this. So in the first one I can ever think of, a boss, apart from the Null Pyromancer obviously, a boss can actually buff your towers to make them shoot faster, even though it's meant to be a 15% fire rate debuff, which is really odd. In addition to this, the Null Guardian clones, they are also meant to have a 30% fire rate debuff, but as we know, when it came to the Null Guardian, it's actually a 30% fire rate buff, so it actually may be slightly advantageous to have the Null Guardian clones kept alive for as long as possible to buff your towers, which seems really odd. Now, there's also a weird case where the Champion Templar can actually buff towers, but it's really complicated and it's barely much of a buff compared to the Null Guardian buffing the fire rate of towers by 15%. So, I will explain it. So, the Champion Templar gives every enemy around it blessed, and with that, it increases the defense of an enemy by 100%. So, for example, if an enemy were to have a 40% defense, this will be buffed to 140%, which is quite high, you might assume. Now, if you were to have a tower that can decrease the defense of enemies by a certain percentage, so for example, if I were to place down a Pyromancer would be able to decrease an enemy health with, an enemy defense with 40% by 20% because it can decrease it by a half. But if that enemy were to get 140% defense, it would be able to decrease it down to 70% because the Pyromancer can melt the defense of half. However, the Blessed modifier is not permanent, so when an enemy were to have its Blessed modifier removed, it goes from, you would think, goes from 70% down to 20%, but that's not the case. It actually just minus 100% of the defense down, so actually it has minus 30% defense. But, interestingly enough, it doesn't. It has 0% defense, so with that, the Champion Templar has an ability which kind of removes more defense from enemies if you have a defense melting tower. Right, so the next thing I want to talk about is name tags, because the developers have updated the name tags one of the name tags in Tower Defense Simulator, namely the green name tag, which, if I believe is to be correct, it is like one of the most common name tags in Tower Defense Simulator, but as you can see here, they've updated it and it looks very Halloween-y. It's because I've already talked about this, I think, but the green name tag has been changed over because the developers have added a green mist name tag to Tower Defense Simulator. This is an exclusive name tag for the developers only, but for some reason the developers have updated it for the green name tag. Now, I obviously do think that this is a mistake because, for example, the green name tag is the same rarity as stuff like the blue name tag, and the blue name tag doesn't have the same effects as the green name tag. It doesn't have any of this mist, it doesn't have any of these bat thingies that are flying out of the name tag. So very clearly it looks like the developers have made a mistake when it comes to the green name tag. They've updated it by mistake instead. Well, they have the green mist name tag in the game, it's just it seemingly is the case where they've updated the green name tag as well. Next, the developers have fixed, they fixed an issue with the modifiers being applied every year. So if you don't know, every year there are like certain modifiers that are applied every day. So for example, there is a modifier which applies cowboy hats to every enemy every year. There is the one that adds a pirate hat to all enemies every year, but also ones for like the game's birthday, for example. However, the developers have now removed all of these modifiers from the game because they weren't posted over into the new system, which means that I don't think these modifiers can actually be applied every day on the same day that it's meant to be applied for. So pertinently for us, it means that on Halloween, the Halloween modifier can no longer be applied from matches starting from the 30th of October to the 1st of November. Next, I'm aware there's only 2 days left, so this may not be relevant, but curses have now been, well, nerfed or buffed. So, for example, the chariot has been buffed, so the negative fire rate buff for the chariot was changed from 15% fire rate debuff to a 10%, but for the tower, instead of being a 25% debuff for the towers, it is now a 10% debuff for towers. Also, when first added, the Null Guardian and the Null Guardian clones did not have logbook descriptions, but these now do actually have logbook descriptions, as you can see here. The developers also buffed the amount of gumdrops per wave on Banlands. Previously it was 7 and 15 on easy and hard mode respectively, but the developers have now buffed it to 12 and 24 gumdrops. Additionally, when enemies are boosted by the speed pads in Night 2 and Night 3, there is now a visual effect for this which surrounds the body of the enemy to indicate that they have been boosted in speed. Additionally, they've also increased the amount of time that you take before you need to skip the cutscenes, because previously I think it was around 10 seconds or 15 seconds, but they have now boosted it by 10 seconds further, so I think it's like 25 or 30 seconds now. The developers have also made an update when it comes to hidden enemies, because previously hidden enemies, they wouldn't be highlighted when you hovered over them. However, now you can now see that they are now hovered in red, so that's an update that they've made to hidden enemies. You may have also noticed a restarting issue in Tower Defense Simulator, where if you were to lose a match, you wouldn't actually be able to restart a game, at least in solo mode. I don't think you're able to restart a game in other game modes, in other servers with different sizes, but I'm not sure on that. But certainly when I've tried to solo Knights and I've accidentally failed them, then I wasn't able to restart those matches. This is the screenshot of what I would get. I would get restart match 0 out of 0. So if I were to press that, then nothing would happen, which is an issue with Tower Defense Simulator where you can't seemingly restart matches in solo mode. Also, very interestingly, the Pursuit has lost its freeze immunity. Previously, the Pursuit did have freeze immunity, which was highlighted here, but as you can see now, it's no longer the case. However, with that being said, it's not a really big loss because for some reason for the Pursuit it was broken. I think it worked with like legacy freeze, so for example when the Titan, the Fallen Titan, in hardcore mode were to hit the pursuit, it wouldn't be frozen. But I'm not sure if it's the case for like other towers, if they still have freeze immunity. Well, it still has stun immunity, I think. Yeah, as you can see here, it has stun immunity, but it no longer has freeze immunity, which is very interesting. And also there's an update which was made to like Night 3 where the box highlighted around the tower is made significantly larger. As you can see here, it's much larger than the tower itself. I don't know why that's the case. Additionally, when it comes to the Knights in Tower Defense Simulator, the developers have actually added regular consumables to those game modes, including the Molten Monster. So in Night 3, Easy and Hard mode, there is a 9% chance that you get the Molten Monster. So if you wanted to grind out Molten Monsters, then I think the best way to get them is perhaps in Easy mode, Night 3. Next, Slow Kings in Tower Defense Simulator, they used to have a purple shield, whereas now, as you can see here, they have an orange shield. But if you were to check the index for the Slow King, it would have a orange shield. So it seemingly is the case where the developers have accidentally updated this to the orange shield that Roblox has, or for some reason uses the same textures that Roblox uses for the lobby. You know that this is not meant to be the case, because if you type in Slow King when it comes to enemies, you'll notice that it has a purple shield, not an orange shield. And the only reason why I think this is the case is because of Roblox textures, because the lobby uses updated Roblox textures, which is why like enemies that use cobbled and granite, they have weird textures, and the Slow King also has an orange texture in the index in the lobby. Next, the developers have fixed an issue where you weren't able to hover over the balloon kit. As you can see here, you can now hover over it, but not over the balloon, because previously you weren't actually able to see like the health of the balloon kit. They haven't actually fixed this for the main boss in Pizza Party. You can't hover over Watts the Fox, as you can see here. You can see its health obviously, but you can't hover over it. Next, the developers have fixed an issue with the Legacy Halo Guard where they weren't able to, or they had broken animations while walking, and I don't think they were able to walk even. However, as you can see here, they now can walk when it comes to the Legacy Halo Guard, which you get, by the way, from getting the Modern Halo Guard logbook. However, as you can see here, they aren't attacking any towers. I think that this has something to do with the fact that these run on legacy code, so they don't actually attack any towers. But it's really weird how they don't attack towers when they certainly did all the way back in 2020. And I think that is everything that's been updated in Tower Defense Simulator since Halloween 2025. Every single thing, which means I think I am now up to date with everything in Tower Defense Simulator, which is very cool.